So we're here to talk about diversity. And I want to make just the blindingly obvious point, which is that diversity in the startup world is absolutely terrible. And for a long time, people have been talking about diversity and saying we need to do something about it, diversity in all its forms. But it doesn't really seem to be getting any better. It's appalling. And there are a few interesting stats just relating to women in the startup world from a startup genome report, which came out recently, with which Jonathan was involved in. But just around 10, in Europe, just around 10 to 20% of founders are women. In Paris and Berlin, it's around 9%, which is pretty bleak. All of these figures are much, much worse when you start talking about class, about ethnic diversity. It's an industry dominated by white men. So from that kind of bleak starting off point, I'm going to bring in Roxanne from Station F. And I really want to ask, why do you think the industry is this way? And what at Station F are you trying to do to make it a little bit better?
I love how depressing we just got before I have to kick it off. So thank you. Very happy to be here, despite that question. So yeah, I think I'm really pleased that we're talking about diversity because it is such a key issue. And I think actually when we talk about diversity, especially at Station F, we're not just talking about female entrepreneurship, but we're talking about people from all kinds of locations and backgrounds, and I'm sure we'll come to it in a moment. Regarding women specifically, it's a topic that is really dear to my heart because I've been involved in kind of promoting female entrepreneurship for about 9-10 years now in the French market. These numbers that you just mentioned blow my mind because at Station F we have very different figures. We have some programs on campus that have 40 to 45% female founders. So I do think it really depends on, you know, what type of profile you're addressing. Is it entrepreneur? Is it a tech background? I think there's a lot of elements that come into play. And I also think that, you know, a lot of people stand there wondering, what are we doing? What can we do differently? How do we get more women? Well, actually, there are a lot of women in tech, despite these numbers that we're mentioning. There are a lot of really incredible women, and I think we really have to work on supporting them, on promoting them, because I think role models are really going to change the dialogue for women and for men alike. And I think people often also forget that this is not just going to be about women changing the situation for themselves. We really need men to pitch in on this dialogue as well. So I really wanted to address that point and also share with you that at Station F, of the 10 companies that were acquired in our first year, the first 2 were founded by female entrepreneurs, the other 8 are not public. So the first 2 that were made public were actually founded by women entrepreneurs as well. So in some places, the situation is quite different.
Who are your role models? Who are your female role models?
I have all kinds of role models. Actually, I'm surrounded by role models at Station F. So I think one of the women that actually founded one of the companies that was acquired, she's an entrepreneur, a young entrepreneur, under 30 years of age. Her name is Jasmine. She's the founder of Recast.ai. And I love her story because she's an artist, initially, who became a developer, who created a chatbot company that was acquired by SAP. I just love that story. And so she's one of my role models. She's younger than I am, and that's just how it is.
So Roxanne, take a slightly more upbeat, rolling back on my depressing intro, but I'm going to continue being depressing. Is part of the problem, Bedy, from the kind of VC, I know you're obviously an accelerator, but also a VC. In terms of the VC industry, is the issue that it is even whiter and more male and more rich than the startup industry? The way you get funding is warm introductions. It's a little club that you need to be a member in. Is the VC industry in some way the problem here, and that filters down into the wider ecosystem?
So I think the direct answer is yes. I do think that because you don't have a lot of women investors having a big sort of seat on the table, and people like us often sort of attract people like us. So that whole funnel has, I think, a direct correlation from the stats from the VC world. The numbers are all like below 10% when you look at the investment team. But I'm also more on the Roxanne side of more optimistic. But also it's because in the past 9 years, we've seen sort of different results. Of course, as a VC fund, ultimately, a lot of people say, you might hear like, we don't want to lower the quality, therefore we're going to have X or Y on a certain underrepresented group. But the data clearly has shown that investing in women founders have created higher results. So specifically, for instance, of the 10 companies that are of unicorn status today at 500, 4 of them are have like women co-founder. There are 2 more that we think it's going to come into becoming a unicorn company too, and both of them have women co-founders. So when you look at the number of what we have, especially because when you look at the proportion, we do have around 30% of our investments into women co-founders, but when you look at the valuation, and I think Roxanne was talking about the exit, I think that looks really good. I think high level on the investment side, I think the problem starts even further up in the channel, which is our limited partners. So very often the LPs are also very white, rich, and male. And then like when we're fundraising for our funds as a women GP, often it's hard. It's fundraising for entrepreneurs are hard, fundraising for funds are hard. So I think that sort of come across altogether. One thing that we've been doing at 500, I think, to the topic of more of ecosystem development, is we've been trying to also train other investors, other angel investors, other GPs. So we set up, for instance, training programs with some schools, for instance, like Stanford, Berkeley, INSEAD, and the idea, because most of the time you will see LPs say like, oh, we don't have enough like women GPs in the market, and then what we want to try to make sure is that we are opening a lot of the playbook that 500 has and open like a broad network of women investors. So we have given like over 50 scholarships to a lot of the women investors that are in our class. And today, around 35% of all the classes that we train, whether it's corporate venture capital, the CVC or angel investors, or all the fund managers that we often like work together, at least 35% are women investors. So hopefully, I hope we can get to 50% altogether among our peers of investors. But I think at least it looks better than the 1 digit that you mentioned. Hopefully we can get to double digit, close to 50%, but at least I think a third of anything that we do, it's like a metric that we should aim for, and hopefully we can get to like at least 50%.
That's a really interesting, I love the idea that it's actually the LPs who are basically to blame, and it's kind of trickling down, the doom is trickling down into the ecosystem. I'm going to come to you in a second, Deemah, but I'm just going to bring in Jonathan here because he has an extremely global perspective on this issue. And not to bring up this same report again, but it does say that Silicon Valley, in terms of female founders, that there's 16% in Silicon Valley and 24% in Shanghai and New York, which is just a world away from the 9% in Paris and Berlin. So Europe looking pretty ropey in the at least female diversity regards. So Jonathan, what are the kind of lessons you've seen? Tons of different ecosystems that are maybe doing a better job. What's your advice for Europe? What do you think needs to be done? What's your take, please?
Great. Well, let me first of all say I want to apologize. I'm here in the home of Station F here, which of course has fantastic female leadership.
You should be sorry.
And no, of course, Jen co-publishes this report with Startup Genome. But obviously what we're trying to do with it, let's take a step back here. We're trying to analyze the top 50 ecosystems in the world and have them learn from each other. So look at it in very, very detailed ways. Obviously, we're surveying hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs in order to be able to get to that point, but to be able to really understand what are the trends. And look, I think if there's any, quote, bad data, all that does is prompt additional behavior. So maybe we'll just get some more of the male white investors in France to pay more attention. But no, moving off this, I mean, I think that the important thing is I would like to agree. I mean, we are seeing a massive level of progress in terms of what I think is the most important factor, which is attitude. You've got people in the United States, for example, like Steve Case. Now, Steve is out there on the speaking circuit talking about the fact that most of the venture money in the United States is going to both coasts. Most of the venture money in the United States is going to male rather than female. So I think part of what we're doing about this and what's already started to be done in other parts around the world, like in China, for example, where I think it's just less built into the culture, is we're just getting individual investors to think about it. Because I don't think that, frankly, you know, male investors or startup communities or the entrepreneurial ecosystems are necessarily discriminating against women. No, I mean, what's really happening here is that they're just not thinking about that in a more active way. So in the United States, you've seen like, you know, Pipeline Angels, which is, you know, focused on women. You've seen obviously the great work that 500 Startups does in this regard. You've also seen, for example, I mean, we have Rebecca Huang on my board at Gen, and you know, both of her funds are exclusively focusing on women investors. So you've seen some very sort of active efforts to really make it easier for women that are at that point that they need investment. But I do think that around the world, what's happened was, let me tell you why it's different around the world. It's different around the world for a really important reason. And that is that we launched something called Global Entrepreneurship Week, which was the idea, which was to sort of open entrepreneurship into the minds of all parts of a country's population. We celebrate it every November in 170 countries. And one of the things we found when we were trying to get countries that didn't have much of an entrepreneurial culture involved in entrepreneurship was we discovered that actually if you got women entrepreneurs to want to do an event about women's entrepreneurship, it would be packed and really popular. And so actually, funny enough, the way that we introduced entrepreneurship into barren entrepreneurial cultures was through women and youth. It wasn't because all of a sudden we had investors. It wasn't because of blockchain or fintech or AI or anything. It was because of movements of individuals. So I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing the disparities overseas, is that you're seeing that there's been a lot more. You know, entrepreneurship wasn't alive and well, and it was the women often that were leading it. And so there were more, frankly, there were more young women that are exploring the path of whether or not they wanted to, you know, figure out a better way of doing something. So, I certainly agree with this. I mean, the data is designed to guide us, and what we have to focus on, most importantly, is what are the barriers, if they exist, to women. So it's not a question, you know, there's one thing which is how do we incentivize more women or more other types of people that are excluded from society to become entrepreneurs. There's another thing to face, and we call it in our world, we need to have a zero barrier environment where anybody, anywhere has the opportunity to start and scale a firm, whether it's a woman or a man, or quite frankly, whether it's another ethnic group or some other group that's left out, because all of our economies suffer if we're excluding elements of our population.
Fabulous. Deemah, if I can bring you in here. I'm really excited to hear your kind of unique perspective on this issue for a very specific, I'm sure you have a global perspective, but I'd be really interested to hear you do a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, which is, a very specific market. What are the challenges of promoting diversity in entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia, and how are you trying to address them?
Well, thank you, Michael, for that. It's, as we have just mentioned in the panel, diversity is not only just female diversity, but diversity as a whole. And I think we're living in Saudi in a very, very exciting time, where we are transforming as a nation, and we are determined in several aspects to transform economically and socially as well. And one of the factors to diversify our economy is to empower more entrepreneurship ecosystem in the countries, either Saudi ecosystem or either opening the doors for foreign investment to come in and support in that transformation and obtain that opportunity that is already there. Several efforts that has been done now in the country that addresses that interest to diversify the economy, empower the entrepreneurship ecosystem, and sustain it. Sustain it by stimulating the innovation-led economy. Now, if we look at the government, for instance, we have established an SME authority that focuses on providing the right policies, regulations, and put in place the empowerment when it comes to incubation, acceleration, to speed up the process of either the mindset of entrepreneurship or also scalability for entrepreneurs and startups. We have also the SAGIA, which opened doors, which is the Saudi Investment Authority, which opened doors to and provided a lot of opportunity for foreign entrepreneurs to come in to Saudi and to use these amazing new projects like NEOM, like Red Sea, like Al-Qiddiya as their test beds. And here is where we see the empowering of diversity, where putting multiple cultures, multiple mindsets, backgrounds all together and working on achieving and obtaining an opportunity. So I think that's something that we have been doing and evangelizing. And here is where that's the government's efforts. We see the private sector efforts in, for instance, connectivity, empowering remote areas and providing an opportunity for accessibility for these remote areas. And that empowers more females to become job creators and not job seekers, and also producers and not consumers. And we see the role of NGOs, and here is where Misk Foundation comes in. Where building the next generation of thought leaders and providing them with the right skills and opportunities to lead and expedite that growth in the knowledge economy, not only in Saudi but globally. And why is that? Is that we believe that diversity and inclusion will expedite that innovation-led economy. So just being here in VivaTech and running with Jen the Entrepreneurship World Cup, where Misk Foundation is empowering more than 100,000 entrepreneurs worldwide in upskilling programs, online incubation, and also funding. That by itself is creating a platform for diversity and empowerment. Now, if we can talk about females, which I know you want to touch base, is we have a very unique ecosystem in Saudi, where that is very different and unique than anywhere in the world, where if you look at the talents, 64% of our IT graduates are females, organically. If you look at most of the programs that Misk Foundation offers, either from an upskilling to trainingship to fellowship to also our incubation and acceleration program, more than 50% of contribution or participation and applications are females. One of the nationwide initiatives that we have launched for digital intelligence and digital literacy was Saudi Codes, which is to teach individuals on the fundamentals of coding, and it's the language of the future. 57% of participation was girls and females, and that's all organically. So in a time where the world is facing challenges to attract girls and females to science and technology, we don't have that challenge. But where is our challenge is sustainability. is sustaining and providing the right opportunities for those females to continue in that field and to provide the right platforms for them to strive and innovate. One of the initiatives that I am leading, which is Women's Spark, that started with upskilling females with the right soft skills, from communicating with confidence to negotiation skills, to knowing who to talk to and what door to knock. To connecting them with the right opportunities to create that job and not seek for that job. And now we are introducing which is, I can say, the first in Saudi, an angel investors network that after working on the upskilling the females, providing with opportunity, now we're working on upskilling the investors and to diversify their investments. We have a lot of females that their wealth are going into very legacy investments, and this initiative is focusing on diversifying that.
Just if you may I add, I was in Saudi on invitation with Misk 10 days ago. And I was so fascinated on like all the different sort of components that you're working on. I know you mentioned the government component, but I think on the ground, when we look at the accelerator program that we work together, the investor training program, the bootcamp for accelerator programs, each of those components have over 30% of the class being women, and the way that you're providing, it's not only for the Saudi. One of the story that I find it like fascinating is like 2 women co-founders from Palestine. They can like launch in Saudi and then scale their business for the entire like Arab community. And I think it's something that you're really providing the platform from all different angles. And then you did mention the sustainability component that goes over the years. So I was really concerned before going. That was my first time. So I was like, and I really care about diversity component. I was like, is that going to be like a class of like only male, and I'm going to be very intimidated? And it was like quite the opposite. And it's really interesting because you often at the global level, you come in with a lot of biases, whether it's conscious or unconscious. But then once you're in the one-on-one with the individual, with the entrepreneurs, it really like unwrap your entire perception, and it like opens the talent at a global level. So I was really impressed.
Well, thank you, Bedy, for that. And also, if I can add and emphasize that it's organic. It hasn't been any efforts to do that. We do have very intelligent, talented females. Now, what is our responsibility, either as Misk Foundation or any other entities, is provide them with the right opportunities, like what we have done with the 500 startups, partnering with global partners to bring them into Saudi and not only serve the Saudi females, but females in the region, because again, diversity is what will embrace and stimulate innovation.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that point, because I know sometimes we have biases before we go into these countries, and we had exactly the same reaction in Saudi Arabia, which was as in our entrepreneurship field to look, and it was exciting to see things not occurring just because it was top-down driven. It was like there's a foundation, there's Kaus, there's Manshat, there's all these other entities that are doing lots of great things. And I want to echo that the Entrepreneurship World Cup is here tomorrow, Saturday, as part of VivaTech, and so we're proud to be part of the Misk partnership with Misk on that. So.
I wanted to jump on the back, actually, because I think I also notice, I think we do it on a global level, but we even do it on a local level. So when people come to visit Station F, a lot of the time they go, no, it's just a place for like these young kids out of school, and they all just, they set up a little startup, and they want to see what will happen. Well, actually, no, the reality is very different. So at Station F, we have people from 16 to 70 years of age creating companies. Average age is around 31 years of age. We have people who are serial entrepreneurs. About 50% of the people we have on campus are serial entrepreneurs. A lot of people don't get paid. There's often a cliche about the entrepreneur as like a money-hungry, crazy guy. And actually, we developed a program on campus for another population that we felt was being under-addressed. So a lot of people, when they start a company, they tend to gravitate towards the profile of white, male, MBA, well-educated, that kind of thing. And we really wanted to address people who come from a radically different background. So we launched the Fighters program. And that is for people who come from underprivileged backgrounds, people who have no higher education, people who may have lived a difficult situation, who might be a refugee. And we today have people participating in those programs who've formerly been homeless, who have formerly been in prison, very different backgrounds from what you would expect traditionally. So I think really as an ecosystem, we should also gain consciousness that we even have these biases on a very local level.
Is there not someone in that program who was a professional car thief who is now designing anti-car theft
exactly.
software?
Who better to design an anti-theft device than a former car thief? So that's the kind of person that we want to see succeed through this program.
One thing to, I think, add to the panel, one thing that it was really interesting, and I think speaking from the Station F, and I think that addresses a little bit of the diversity component. A lot of people talk about maybe the numbers, but it's very important that you inject that mindset into different system within your organization. So for instance, when we requested to run an event, just like most recently at Station F, we didn't even talk, Roxanne and I didn't talk, but the person who was the coordinator said, we do not allow to have a panel without a certain gender or a certain diversity component. So it's very often to put into the system, because you can say, all right, we have the 10% or we have the 9%, but if you don't change it, I think on two angles, right, that I mentioned. One angle is like, do you have that bias before you come in? So every time you're interviewing or every time you're putting a panel together, you always have that bias of like, what will create a good content? I think that's the first one for us to fight. And then the second for us to fight is put structure into the system that I think is how you really like unwrap what the culture is. So when I talk to someone, especially with I know that's a lot of the push from Roxanne, because you work with diversity even before Station F, but it's into every single little piece of the touch point that I think organizationally I would encourage everyone to do, right? And then we're obsessed at 500, we're trying to see like, what are the different touch points that can create the real change? So very often we're thinking, are there things that if we are putting a pre-money conference, for instance, we constantly ask, like, is this the right balance that we have in? When we're recruiting someone, we always ask, do we have the right balance of whether it's gender, whether it's sexual preference, whether it's color, race. So we always try to make sure that there is sort of this space for people to join. I think that's first. And then the second is, do they feel, because you can join and then you can have the diversity number and then that's versus that, but do they feel included into that culture that you're putting in? And I think it's very important to design the culture in a way that it's very inviting.
Yeah. One type of diversity we haven't talked about is geographical diversity. At Sifted, covering European tech, one of our missions was not just to write about London, Paris, Berlin, Barcelona, but to write about second and third cities, to write about the kind of undiscovered parts of Europe, because there's a lot going on. Roxanne, France is uniquely centralized in Paris and always has been. How do you make sure that you're getting the kind of range of talent from the whole country, or indeed, trying to get that guy or that person from the Ukraine, from the fourth city in the Ukraine, to come on board at Station F, and maybe that's the next unicorn for you guys. How do you do that?
So people have this cliche that the French ecosystem is very Franco-French, and actually that's not the case at all. I think it's been changing quite a bit over the past few years. So at Station F, we have 1,000 companies that are based on campus, 11,000 applications. We had 1/3 of our candidates and the people on campus that come from abroad. Countries that send us the most applications, you guys are going to see the politics play into this, in order are the US, the UK, China, and India. So I think political situation in the US and the UK has brought a lot of people to maybe a place they weren't looking at before.
And we have one Saudi.
We have some Saudis.
Well in Station
Yes, actually at Station F, I'm always amazed. We have so many delegations from around the world, and we'll just ask, like, who's from Guatemala, who's from Lithuania? We always have people that pop up. And so, but yeah, I think actually we have naturally managed to receive a lot of international entrepreneurs. We have 600 people on campus that don't speak French, so we do a lot in English. And I think these numbers are going to continue to grow, especially now that the French government has even made a push for the visas. So previously it was just for the entrepreneurs or the founders that they could easily get visas. Now they've just announced a few months ago that they're also going to be helping employees. So I think we're going to see a radically different ecosystem in a few months.
Jonathan? Geographical diversity.
I'll add to that because obviously it's the foundation of what our organization is built on, namely that we want to make it possible for anyone, anywhere to start and scale a company. And you know, we obviously operating in 170 countries, we have a very deliberate strategy as to where we focus our attention. And we actually spend the least amount of time in like San Francisco, New York, Berlin, and Paris. We spend most of our time, we actually start at the ones that have the least amount of entrepreneurial activity. And if you look at it from a global economy perspective, it has a massive impact if you can move the ball forward in those economies in terms of creating entrepreneurial communities where they didn't exist before. So it's not so much a question of necessarily, you know, attracting international entrepreneurs into one city. It's like, how do we take all the very best knowledge networks and communities we've got and allow those to be open around the world. So we view our role as trying to build one global entrepreneurial ecosystem. But the most exciting thing is what Roxanne is obviously addressing, which is we're seeing huge amount of ecosystem tourism. You know, because actually we've got managing directors in most of these countries, and they actually will individually, if you want, they'll give you a tour of their ecosystem. Now, Roxanne's really busy this week, but I'm sure in other weeks, if I called her up and I might say, can you tell me how the ecosystem here in Paris works and tell me how, you know, beyond Station F and Station F? But this is exciting, and the biggest barrier for policymakers, and certainly the biggest barrier to entrepreneurship in the United States, without doubt, is talent. It's high-skilled immigration. It's the fact that we in the United States don't have a startup visa like they do in Canada and like they do in now 47 other countries. And so I think you'll find that the ability to move people, you know, around the world is vitally important, because most of those people at Station F will not forget where they came from. And they are going to be the very powerful people that go back into their communities and bring networks. They're going to bring culture. They're going to bring that, you know, powerful element of what we know makes an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I certainly think the geographical diversity part, I mean, for me personally, I think it's the most important challenge we have, because we're facing a time where, because of populism and nationalism, we're seeing actually entrepreneurship and perhaps actually football, soccer for the Americans, you know, or sport generally, and entrepreneurship are probably the two common languages across absolutely every economy. And we are welcomed. It doesn't matter. I mean, if you look at the work that we're doing in Russia, for example, we're not doing so much in Moscow, but we're in 15 other cities throughout, you know, Russia. If you look at the work that we're doing in some of these other countries, Steve Case has called it the rise of the rest, and he's been referring to it in the context of the United States, of the mid-tier cities in between the two coasts. We're talking about the rise of the rest around the world. And we're talking about the fact that we need to make sure that it's not just, I mean, you know, and quite frankly, even though Saudi Arabia is a very wealthy country, this is a very powerful moment, because entrepreneurship is opening up your society, because it's bringing a new type of culture which has even bigger impact than just creating jobs and unleashing innovation. So yeah. I think it's a very powerful element.
I'm afraid that we've run out of time here, but I tried to make this as downbeat and gloomy as humanly possible, and everyone is roused, has got a kind of rousing optimism, and we ended on a note of the rise of the rest of the rest. It's not just the rest, it's coming from everywhere, all parts of Saudi Arabia. It's women, it's class, it's everything. So we have an upbeat audience, and I hope people can leave slightly happier than when they started. I'd like to invite a huge round of applause for our fantastic panel, please. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming.